The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is warning that Europe is at a critical moment, and we know diplomats from Russia and the West are still engaged in repeated rounds of talks. But today is the first time since December we've actually heard from President Putin himself on this subject. Here's what he had to say.
The United States' most important goal is to contain Russia. That's the thing. In this sense, Ukraine itself is just a tool to achieve this goal. This can be done in different ways. One of them is to draw us into some armed conflict.
Meanwhile, Boris Johnson's been meeting with Ukraine's President Zelensky in Kiev, and afterwards we heard from the Prime Minister.
It goes without saying that a further Russian invasion of Ukraine would be a political disaster, a humanitarian disaster. In my view, it would also be, for Russia, for the world, a military disaster as well. And the potential invasion completely flies in the face of President Putin's claims to be acting in the interests of the Ukrainian people.
Well, also today, President Zelensky signed an order for the country's armed forces to increase by 100,000 over the next 3 years. Next, let's hear from him.
The Prime Minister assured me the support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity, the continuation of cooperation under the Crimean platform, de-occupation of our peninsula and bringing back all of our territories. We have discussed also the set of activities to provide the deterrence of Russian Federation. Any activities, as I said, are efficient before rather than after. Prevention is better than treatment.
Now, this story revolves around a recent escalation of Russian military activity close to Ukraine. Russia has over 100,000 troops close to the Ukrainian border. It's also got troops conducting military exercises in Belarus. In fact, today, the US told its staff there to leave. We've also heard from the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, who's been telling his Russian counterpart to de-escalate. Well, here's Sergei Lavrov's response.
We
will insist on an honest conversation, an honest explanation of why the West does not want to fulfill its commitments or wants to fulfill them only selectively in its favor.
Well, Russia has denied all along that it's planning to invade Ukraine. It does, though, have demands. You heard Sergei Lavrov refer to them there. Top of the list is no NATO membership for Ukraine. It also wants NATO to stop its expansion eastwards, and it wants the rollback of all NATO military deployments in the region. America hasn't agreed to any of that. Here's the analysis of a former US commanding general in Europe.
I have not seen a diplomatic effort by the United States at this level of intensity and scale probably since 1995 during the Dayton Peace Accord efforts. The Biden administration, Secretary Blinken, all of our professional diplomats have been working very closely, of course, with our allies and partners to maintain this unity, because I really do believe this is the key. This transition to active deterrence, providing capabilities that Ukraine has asked for. And by the way, Ukraine has not asked for a single soldier, but what they are asking for is support.
And while the diplomacy continues, both Russia and Ukraine have been holding military drills today. These pictures show Russia's strategic missile forces holding exercises. And then here you can see the Ukrainian army holding its own military drills close to the Crimea region, which Russia annexed from Ukraine in 2014. Now, the latest country to back Ukraine with military hardware is Poland, and we've also heard from its Prime Minister.
Our part of Europe does not experience earthquakes or volcanic eruptions. But living close to a neighbor like Russia, we have the feeling of living at the foot of a volcano.
As you can see, there is a lot of diplomatic activity. Another meeting that's happened is Vladimir Putin speaking with the Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi. Mr. Draghi has stressed the need for de-escalation. Also today in Moscow, President Putin held talks with Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Mr. Orban is arguably Russia's closest ally in the European Union. Indeed, he's been criticised by some EU member states for going ahead with this meeting. But this is what he had to say.
My visit today is partly also a peace mission. I would like to assure you that not a single European Union member state's leader would like war. We stand for a political solution in favour of peace agreements.
Well, let's talk to the BBC Chief International Correspondent Lise Doucette, who's live with us from Kiev, and our Washington correspondent Barbara Plett-Usher, who's live with us from the US State Department. Lise, let's begin with you. Help us understand what the West is trying to achieve today with these multiple different diplomatic maneuvers.
A very public show of support for President Zelensky. Not less than 3 European prime ministers in Kiev today. No wonder the members of parliament, no matter what side they're on politically, all stood up and they held up the flags of the nations who have been giving support to Ukraine. It was a forest of flags. President Zelensky will feel very much that the European countries, that NATO has his back, but he made it clear in that press conference today that if there is to be an invasion of Ukraine or any kind of military activity, it would not be a Ukrainian-Russian war, it would be a European war, and therefore Boris Johnson very much took the very same line, saying this is a critical moment, this is an attempt to redraw the security map, and we must all stand together. So very symbolic steps like visits of prime ministers, but also a lot of military support. Hardly a day goes by without some military support of some kind arriving, and also economic support, which is also on the minds of Ukrainians.
Stay with us, please, Lise. Let's bring you in, Barbara, at the State Department. What are you hearing there?
Well, Secretary of State Blinken had a call with his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, this morning, and officials here briefed us on the call. I think the upshot of that, Roz, is that there wasn't really any movement that came out of it, at least not that we could see. The tone was professional and fairly candid, they said, which makes a big difference from that very bitter and public exchange at the UN yesterday between Russia and the United States. But by and large, it sounded as if both men held to their positions. This call came after the Americans had submitted a formal security proposals to Moscow last week to address Russian security concerns in Europe. Basically, the Secretary of State said, we think this will work. We just would like to talk about a format for how we can negotiate. But Mr. Lavrov wasn't ready to move on that score. He, I think, again repeated the Russians' concerns that this didn't go far enough. He also gave no indication, according to senior officials, that there was any move to de-escalate the way the Americans wanted it to happen. And he again said, we're not escalating. And Mr. Blinken said, well, now would be a very good time then to follow through and pull back your troops from the border. So they basically agreed to talk again, Roz, after the Russians respond formally to the American security proposals. And the Americans have said, well, we think this means that they are interested in diplomatic engagement. Yes, maybe they are just trying to draw things out. We don't know. But as long as they're willing to talk, we are ready to talk with them.
And so, Barbara, let's pick up on that point with Lise. If there is a willingness to talk, aside from the public rhetoric we're hearing, Lise, there still has to be some common ground. And when we look at the public positions of America and Russia, there doesn't appear to be any. But you're talking to the people involved in this diplomatic tussle. Do you think there may be some route out of this without a conflict?
It will take some very clever diplomatic language, Roz, because both sides, and Ukraine as well, has red lines. And the red lines are drawn now in bright red fluorescent paint, and those red lines are very far apart. But you can use words like what will be the fate of eastern Ukraine? Will it be special status, as in the Minsk agreement? Will it be autonomy? That's what Russia wants. So it will be a creeping towards a greater connection to Russia. It will be very hard. It was interesting today that President Zelensky made a point of saying that one format for dialogue that was working was the Normandy format, the Normandy group, which includes Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia. It's one place where the Ukrainians and the Russians get together, because one person who's not been talking to President Putin on the telephone is President Zelensky, because President Putin doesn't pick up the phone to call him.
Lise, thank you. And one final question to Barbara. I wonder, Barbara, in domestic political terms for President Biden, how does this fit in? Is the escalating diplomatic tensions, are they cutting through in US media coverage?
There is a lot of media coverage about the US-Ukraine crisis, so to speak. Mr. Biden has been getting fairly good marks from the foreign policy establishment for the way that he has thrown intensive diplomacy at this issue and the way he has really sought to coordinate and unify the European and the American response. Many foreign policy experts here think that this is the right approach and that he's also projecting strength by trying to organize a very stiff sanctions response and otherwise if there is an invasion. He does get some pushback from the Republican Party. There is a small minority amongst those who have taken up sort of Donald Trump's kind of pro-Russian, anti-interventionist rhetoric. But by and large, the Republican Party is with the Democrats on this.